on the global stage. Okay. We have still a political weight on the global stage. Our values of individual freedoms, which we can enforce in front of courts, the rule of law and democracy remain attractive. However, our economic and political model is no longer uncontested. It's challenged. New emerging powers are claiming economic and political influence. China, in particular, is challenging the West's promise of prosperity, not least during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have seen this particularly during the last months of the pandemic. Many geopolitical competitions are take place in the moment. At the EU's external borders, we continue to experience the pressures of mass migration. We experience a new confrontation between East and West in Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and elsewhere. And after a decade of stagnation in Southern Europe, we face the most severe economic crisis since the end of the Second World War. Having said that, I have not even started to mention the impact of the digital transformation for our workplaces and societies. The point I want to make here is the following. The premises on which European integration was built with the treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon in the post-Cold War era have changed radically. If we want to preserve our ambition of the European Union as a guarantor of peace, security, individual freedoms, and prosperity, we need to adapt our institutions to the new realities. I think this was partly the impetus behind President Macron's embrace of a conference on the future of Europe. This conference is a chance, I would say, and I strongly believe we need to make active use of it. The conference raises expectations and will only be a success if we have tangible results. And if these results are aligned with the expectations of our citizens, of course. And this is something absolutely key and that we sometimes, in particular in academic circles, lose sight of. There is little to an abstract debate about catchphrases like European Republic, European federalism, or a European of nations on the other side. What we need to be much more hands-on and pragmatic in our debates. The focus should instead be on the question of how the European Union should look in 10 to 15 years in question of substance, not labels. How do we prepare the European Union to hold its own in a world defined by unilaterally acting superpowers? Superpowers with which no European nation state can compete on its own. For what do the Europeans need the European Union most in the 21st century? Well, in my opinion, we should define joint responses to the major policy challenges that we face together today, such as climate change, the migration crisis, or the digital transformation. We will rebuild trust and legitimacy in the European Union if we can demonstrate that a joint European approach in these policy fields is superior to small-scale national solutions. In Europe, we have two different kinds of states. We have small states and those states who know that they are small states, but small are they all. And in this regard, it is crucial to think about national and European sovereignty in conjunction. This is a new paradigm that I advocate for. European integration began under Konrad Adenauer and Robert Schuman with the idea of ensuring mutual protection through joint control of war-related industries, coal and steel. Today, the issue is external protection, securing Europe's common position in the world. Europe should no longer be about protecting Europeans from each other, but rather enable them to protect through each other. We need what I call a paradigm shift, a shift of paradigm from an inward-looking approach to a global focus for the EU. But if we want to credibly achieve this, we first need an honest and frank debate about the status quo of our union. My impression is that we often oscillate in public debates between self-righteous celebration of the EU and its achievements on one side, and narrow-minded nationalism on the other side. But precisely, since I am pro-European, I believe that we need to be more self-critical in the beginning. With its current structure and political practices, I would say the European Union is sufficiently equipped to tackle new challenges. We need to become better here. We are sometimes disappointing citizens' expectations. This has been the case during the Euro crisis, during the migration crisis, and now again during the pandemic. Recent polling has indicated that in Germany, for example, and that was a country which always was very much in favor of the European Union, but in the moment, trust in the EU is at the lowest point since 2011. So the institutional problems of the European Union are, in my opinion, threefold in my assessment, at least. First, we have a deficit in democratic legitimacy. Secondly, too little capabilities to act, in particular, too little capabilities to act externally. And finally, a lack of focus within the institutions compared with a lack of accountability of the institutions, in particular the European Commission. First, focus. Promoting European added value. Where do we see a clear added value? All too often, the European Union's current complex division of competencies or powers make it difficult for those not directly involved to understand how powers and responsibilities are shared between Brussels and national capitals. Europe must be strong in policy areas where the countries that make up the Union can achieve more together than alone. That seems to me very clear. Examples: increasing prosperity by boosting international competitiveness through joint investment in research and innovation. We have seen that with the vaccination, through strategic autonomy in trade, a common digital single market, an EU-wide emission trading scheme to mitigate climate change, external border protection, a united common foreign, development, and defense policy. Here we are not united at all, and we are not as successful as we could be in those policy fields. If you look at polling for these individual policy areas, a broad majority of Europeans across member states supports greater competencies, greater powers in these areas. Since the European Union does not define these areas as political priorities, the EU is often perceived as an overarching bureaucracy that threatens local and national identities. Focusing on European added value also means that the EU must concentrate much more on these essentials than it has to date. The logical consequence is that in certain policy areas, less European involvement may be the better option. At least we have to discuss that. Intervening, for example, in national policies on social protection, families, and the labor market, or considering a European financial equalization system or a European social insurance scheme, harbors considerable potential for divisiveness. And so the EU can only work if it puts subsidiarity and individual responsibility into practice. But then we should empower the European Union to solve problems. Citizens sometimes expect more from the European Union than it can deliver under the current treaties. And I don't know how much you know about the European Union, and we can also talk about the structure generally and the treaties, that it was founded by 2 treaties by international law, but now is a supranational entity. And increasingly, individual member states are paralyzing decision-making in the institutions through a veto, particularly on foreign policy. Decisions are often more aligned with national interests than with a common good, And there is sometimes a common European good, but it's not seen or not regarded in the public debates in the member states. During crisis, new parallel intergovernmental structures are often created. That happened during the Euro crisis and also now. And they compete with the community method of the EU treaties. And in crisis situations in particular, a concerted joint approach is vitally important. If you don't have that and are always negotiating with 27 member states plus the European Commission, then it's a very slow, it doesn't make progress, and it's a very slow negotiating process. And the result is that we are behind and we are not as successful as we could be. Perhaps that was also one of the reasons why the Europeans are vaccinated slower than it was the case in the US. There are other reasons as well. We can also talk about that one. So if we want to ensure that the European Union has a greater scope to take action, we must overcome sclerotic structures in Europe. The world does not simply sit and wait for Europe to respond, and that holds true to an even greater degree for unforeseeable events like the pandemic. Europe must be able to respond to challenges rapidly and forcefully. However, being able to react is not the whole story. Enabling the EU to play a proactive role in shaping developments is crucial. To that end, changes must be implemented in the areas where citizens still all too frequently experience policy as out of touch with reality and lacking transparency. And for that reason, I am convinced that on the third pillar, we need to strengthen democracy in Europe. The European Union has reinforced democracy and the rule of law in Europe, thereby securing peace, first in the West and later in the East. Through its institutions, the EU has created an additional level on which citizens can share in decision-making and has paved the way for protection of fundamental and civil rights. However, the EU's democratic framework has not kept pace with recent rapid changes in its remit and the new challenges we face. As a result, citizens' expectations concerning the EU are regularly disappointed, leading them to grow disenchanted with the European integration project. And in this regard, my party or my group here in the parliament, the CDU, CSU members of the parliament, as well as my group, the EPP, the European People's Party in the European Parliament, we have both passed extensive position papers with concrete proposals on how to reform European democracy. Increasing, that is perhaps the most important point, the accountability of the Commission by, for example, entrenching the so-called lead candidate or Spitzenkandidat principle in political practice. The Commission is an institution with 27 commissioners, and they are sent by the national governments. The Commission is not like a government which is accountable to the Parliament. We vote the Commission president once, and then he or she is in office, and it's very difficult to control from the Parliament, and it's also very difficult to see for the voters where is the political majority and where is the minority in the Commission. It's a Commission with EPP members, with Social Democrats, with Green members, with Liberal Democrats. So it's really a problem of communicating democracy. Majority and minority is not existing. And in the Parliament, we have a very consensus-driven approach, which also makes it very difficult to communicate political decisions. Democracy is about choosing and sometimes also voting against somebody to get rid of him or her. Fostering parliamentary control through greater rights of investigation is one of the proposals. Budgetary rights on the multi-annual financial framework, and of course a right of initiative for the Parliament, not so much to draft new legislation, but also to amend and change existing rules and regulations. These are all measures that should be on the table during the conference on the future of Europe, regardless of whether they require treaty changes or are even possible without a treaty change or without a new convent. What is really important to me is that we do not stifle our ambitions for the future of Europe through a kind of, well, pseudo-realism. It is not realistic, was not the phrase that was on the minds of Schuman and Adenauer when they, more than 70 years ago now, were promising themselves after the Second World War that they want to integrate and work together. For them, any integration steps in a continent, on a continent that was still in ruins after the two world wars, was a much greater challenge than we have it today, but we also have a great challenge. It was by then not universally popular, neither in France nor in Germany, to share sovereignty after centuries of animosities and wars. Yet they overcame all these obstacles and reached out a hand of reconciliation and friendship. And these founding fathers of the Union were driven by the idea or ideas of what was convenient. They were driven by what they believed in was right. And I hope that our generation of Europeans and European citizens and politicians alike takes inspiration from these actions. There's much more that I could say on each of these individual points or topics, but what matters to me is also your perspective. So I'm also here very much for listening your perspective. That is minimum 50% of my job, to listen to citizens, to listen to people, to listen to an audience which has a different background, a different view. And perhaps you can, when you take the floor, also tell me where you are from, what's your background, what you study, or what's your job. That makes it then a little bit clear in which context, so to say, you ask your question or you give your comment. And if you only want to give a comment, please feel free, because that is very much welcomed by me. I need this feedback from you and those ideas and that view you have on the European Union. So I'm now very much looking forward to your questions, comments, and proposals. Thanks again for having me, and thanks again for inviting me. And now I will listen to all your questions and comments.
So first, thank you. I guess I'm the first one. My name is Benayahu. My background is I live in Israel. I was born and raised in a ranch in the south of Israel, and that is where I am right now. I'm a student of government in Herzliya. I think that's enough about myself. So first off, thank you. Second thing, I would like to ask you what are the main reasons for optimism about the future of the EU. And I'm saying that in regard, I know that I am biased in the information I'm receiving because I'm not in the EU and I see it only from outside, but a common sort of criticism I hear about it, if I may, is that this need for consensus makes it less apt for rapid and I would say a powerful decision, collective action. So if you could touch upon this issue, especially let's say in regard of the Iranian nuclear program, for as a case study for European collective action.
Yeah. So the main question was reasons for optimism. Did I get that right? Okay, I was very happy to hear the first question from Herzliya, since I have a very good friend. I met him this morning in Frankfurt, and his parents live in Herzliya, so he's from Tel Aviv as well, Avi Weber. Okay, the reasons for optimism. Well, I would say that it is so obvious and so clear that we have certain policy fields like international trade, defense, energy and climate change, as well as digital transformation, where the Europeans, from an external perspective, can only compete with other regions in the world when they stay together. The Germans, or let me start it differently, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Europeans have been 20% of the world population. Today, we are 7%. In 2050, the Europeans will be 5% or even less. And if people from the right-wing populists who are fighting against the European Union, I always ask the question, well, do you really think that Germany, with 1% of the world population, can act more successful when negotiating an international trade treaty with China? And if you see the other regions in the world, China, more than 1 billion people, India, more than 1 billion people, Southeast Asia, more than 1 billion people again, that doesn't make sense. So in my opinion, it's so obvious that we have policy fields where we only can act successfully when we act together. And that is also true for your example. I don't want to precisely answer the question whether this Iran nuclear treaty is a good thing or not. And possibly we won't have a consensus here. I always thought it was a good thing. But what you also could see is that if Europe is not standing together, they are weaker. And Europe was also not sovereign in a way that whenever the United States wanted to behave Europe in a special way, that has to do with the currency and the power of the currency, for example, Europe was always behind in a way. Europe is not a leading power since we are so divided. So that is a very good example to make it clear that Europeans need a common foreign policy and that Europeans need a strong currency in order to have a global say on the world stage. And this, I think, leads to optimism that people finally will find out it's perhaps better to stay together when we want to reach. And also, if I perhaps another example from my field of expertise, I'm not so much dealing with general foreign policy, but I'm in the International Trade Committee. And here it's very obvious and clear. When we as Europeans want to export, in a way, part of our values, of our rules, of our standards, consumer protection, environmental protection, we are so much stronger if we negotiate as all Europeans together when we negotiate international trade deals than if that would be done by a smaller country.
Hi, I will be asking you the next question. My name is Amit Baran. I'm originally from the south of Israel, but I go to school at North Carolina Central. I'm a business student. And my question is, during the lecture, you mentioned about the climate change crisis that Europe is facing. Can you collaborate on that? And from your opinion, what do you think that the EU should do in order to impact even globally? Thank you.
Yeah, there are many topics on the table. We have the Green Deal now, which was proposed by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission. And there are many topics in that concern. I think generally, I would say there are two political approaches or two ways in Europe and in the European Parliament. One will not be successful. This is done by the Greens, if I may be so open. And here I'm not neutral anymore, but this is not what you expected, I think, from a politician. And the other one will be successful. The one which will not be successful if we say, oh my gosh, there's a real crisis and we have to deindustrialize everything immediately. That's the Green way. That's the Green proposal. Pushing down all industry, and my best example is steel production. Of course, steel production needs a lot of energy and it produces CO2. There are two ways now. Either we punish the steel industry by regulations in Europe that we kill them and no steel will be produced in the future on the European continent, with the result that from the steel production, there won't be any CO2 emissions in Europe. But what will we do? Of course, we will buy it from China. And what the Chinese do and how they produce steel, we don't know. Most probably not much better than the Europeans do when we take into account climate change. So what makes sense is the way we propose, and the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is proposing. We propose we can fight the climate change through innovation and technology. For example, firing the steel industry with hydrogen and not coal anymore. So that is, for example, that is only one example. We will manage, if we in the end are the most ambitious continent, through innovation and technology without destroying prosperity. Because if we in Europe destroy prosperity and our industry, nobody in the world will follow us. We have to be a role model. We have to be more ambitious than others, since we are an industrialized continent already, and the others also want to develop, of course. But if we manage successfully this transformation into a carbon-free continent, a carbon-free industry, without losing competition in this field of prosperity, without destroying our industry, then others will follow. If we have this other approach, nobody will follow, and in that way we harm the fight against climate change.
Thank you so much.
Hi, and my name is Mohammed, and I'm from IDC Herzliya. And before I ask my question, I want to say thank you, and it's a privilege to hear you talking. And also, I am interested a lot in Bismarck's Germany and how he united the German states. So my question is how can you combine between the cultures and the folks in the EU? So I have planned in the future to start to something like EU in the Arabic in the Middle East, with the Arabic states. So, and the culture issue is a very, very difficult thing, and I guess especially in Europe, it's hundreds of years that the European nations fought each other, and if we go back to history, we can see that the French people collaborated with the Ottomans against the Germans and all the other folks in Europe. So how you in the EU got in this problem and defeated? So how can we do it here?
Yeah, that is actually a really interesting question, and I very much like this combination, what you did when you started with the Bismarck situation. When I'm teaching constitutional history, which I sometimes do, then I always also come to this point when we had the unification of the Federal Republic of Germany, which was also a beginning with many, many states, and then we had a federation, and finally then a federal state. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, how Bismarck united Germany. And do you know what he had to do to bring Bavaria to the federation?
Yeah, I guess that he went to a war against Denmark, and also he broke the relations with Austria and the French.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to say this: he's one of my top 3 diplomats all over the history. He's number 2 after Nixon. So,
okay, but I hope that we don't need a war to bring the Europeans together to a European Union, but perhaps we need a common enemy. That is perhaps true, yeah. On the second part of the question, that is really complex, and my impression is that when we talk about culture or cultural differences, we didn't draw the focus on that. We simply ignored it and were surprised and disappointed when we found out that there are huge cultural differences. Let me give you one example in my field of expertise, law and the rule of law. How does the rule of law apply, and what's the relationship between law and politics? I have to keep it brief now, but I wrote an article and I give my inaugural lecture at Marburg University on that topic, legal cultural differences in Europe and the European Union. The relationship between law and politics in France, for example, is totally different compared to Germany. In Germany, that already started with Kant. And then, of course, because of the Holocaust and the Shoah and the history, the rule of law and the German Constitutional Court, for example, and the court structure, the independence of courts, and so played a much bigger role compared to France. If you take the word rule of law, which is not a precise translation of the German word Rechtsstaat, and if you compare what is meant with état de droit, which is a translation from Rechtsstaat from the 60s, but with a totally different meaning, and if you compare the concepts of rule of law in the United Kingdom and Rechtsstaatlichkeit and Rechtsstaatsprinciple in Germany, that's totally different. In the UK, it's more a procedure. In Germany, we have very powerful human rights, which you can individually claim in front of a court. So that's only one part, but also other cultures. On the other hand, if I travel to Asia, China or so, then people usually realize, oh, we have many things, also cultural things in common in Europe, so to say. But you are absolutely right that cultural differences play a big role, but we didn't really take them into account properly during our integration process. I just come from a meeting where we again discussed the new electoral law for the European Parliament. And my colleague from Portugal is always arguing, no, I cannot agree on transnational lists. First of all, there is no federation in the world which has only one constituency, a transnational list. But then he's telling a lot of 300 years of history of Portugal with this alliance to the UK in defense matters and so on and so forth, and that they are a smaller peripheral state in Europe. And that's very interesting. And the argumentation he's doing is also culturally, in a way, very different compared to how a German the German approach would be. So it's very important, the question you asked, and my impression is that we didn't take into account cultural differences while the European integration took place. And for that reason, we are sometimes disappointed when, for example, the Euro crisis happened. And in France, politicians said more or less, well, of course, I mean, we have something in the treaties, but now we have a crisis. So it's not so important what the legal letters say. Let's take a different political decision and get things done, solve the problem. And this was, of course, not the German approach. And for that reason, there was a big disappointment. But it's a very important question of the cultural differences. And I think the problem is not solved. We must talk openly about it, which we didn't do so far.
Well, I have just one more thing to say. But if we took it, if I took what you just said to the one-state solution, so how can I involve this? So if I look at the UK, but like there's Welsh, there's England, and there's Scotland, and the issue there is like by far it was more critical than the issue here. But now they all joined each other and they create some kind of union and they joined the EU. But how can I took this model and start working it in one-state solution, like, if you know what I mean. So
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
also, we have here three different sections. We have Palestine, we have Israel, and we have Gaza.
Yeah, I think in the Middle East, it is a situation which is which you cannot compare with our situation here. There you have the religious conflict and the old historical conflict. I don't also know whether you really can compare the United Kingdom with the European Union. Sometimes I'm wondering whether they are so closely together. I remember a situation when I studied at Warwick University and the teacher asked us in the first seminar, "Where are you from?" And there was a colleague who said, "I am Welsh." And then the teacher said, "So you are a home student?" And he said, "No, I'm Welsh." "So that means you are a home student?" No, I'm Welsh." He insisted on that. And the other interesting point is when now the United Kingdom, sadly and unfortunately, it was a historical mistake, which we have to accept, but it was a mistake, left the European Union, Scotland would like to remain. And if there would be a referendum in Scotland today, I think they would vote to remain or to go back to the European Union, even if that was not, it would not be legal in the moment, as long as central London is not, or the parliament is not giving its consent to that. But I'm wondering whether they also have political, cultural differences. My opinion is how to overcome this problem, or how to perhaps not solve it, but in a way make it smaller. It's always about exchange, starting as early as possible. We should, and this is in our program, enable each citizen in school, at university, or whenever possible to live for half a year in another family. And that would make sense. I'm also sure in Middle East, there are some projects like this orchestra or other things. If you would live as a smaller, or in your younger, if young people would live on the other side, in a family of the other side, they would absolutely think differently and overcome cultural differences, religious differences. And so I would say it's mainly a question of exchange, sensitivity, knowledge about the thoughts of the other side, and having a common ground and understanding for the others.
Hi, my name is Annabelle Marie and I'm based in London in the UK. And I completely agree with your stance on Brexit, by the way. But you mentioned that the EU's position on promoting democratic nations across Europe, and surely the cornerstone of most democracies is sovereignty. From my understanding, working closer together could mean all nations give up more sovereignty. Would you agree that could make the EU more effective?
I would put it in a different way, and the Czech Constitutional Court has used the terminology of sovereignty in a different way. They said, well, member states do not lose sovereignty. We pool our sovereignty on the supranational level in order to get back sovereignty. That's not true for any policy field. If we speak about social policy, sometimes, for example, health, the whole health insurance system, education, that doesn't make us stronger at all. The European Union should not get any power in those fields. And sometimes the European Union is already now regulating things which they should not do. Here in the European Parliament, we are talking about 3 topics, mainly climate, gender, sometimes migration. The gender issue, oh, that has nothing to do with the European Union mainly. It's in the competence of the member states mainly. So let's do the member states that. But other topics, when we speak about our defense policy, when we speak about sovereignty and defense, Europe is not able, Germany is not able to defend itself in the moment. Perhaps we can as Europeans, I doubt it. It's also very weak. Or other topics like trade, when we see the trade policy or when we see fighting climate change. No single member state is sovereign on that policy field. So we are only sovereign, we get back sovereignty if we pool our sovereignty on the European level. And the task we have now during the conference on the future of Europe is to find out which policy fields we have to pool on a supranational level in order to get back sovereignty, and which policy fields perhaps are by the principle of subsidiarity and proportionality better in the hands of the member states. This is our task now in the moment. But generally, I prefer this terminology of the Czech Constitutional Court, that by transferring power to the supranational level, it does not necessarily mean that we give up sovereignty. It can also mean that we bring back sovereignty by pooling our sovereignty on the supranational level for policy fields in which member states are too small and too weak.
Hello everyone. I don't know what time there is, but Assalamu alaikum to everyone. My name is Shazad and I'm from Pakistan, a student of international relations. I was doing a research at my last semester about the Greece-Turkey conflict in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, in the agency. So I came with some recommendation as well in my research, but I want your opinion about the conflict and what kind of constructive measure the European Union gonna take about that specific conflict between Greece and Turkey in the agency.
Yeah, this is perhaps a topic for a bilateral answer. I'm not an expert on that. That's our foreign policy committee. And here is the problem again, that the European Union doesn't have many competencies in the foreign affairs field. It's always a highly disputed topic, also here in the parliament. The Greek colleagues very often, or the colleagues from Cyprus, from the Greek part, very often complain that the European Union is not supporting them enough, and sometimes blocking totally different foreign policy decisions, for example, the sanctions on Belarus. That was one of those examples where the European Union was blocked by a foreign policy decision which would otherwise have been agreed on, but again, a unanimous decision. It is a difficult one for the European Union because Turkey is not only a big country, a neighbor country, but it's also a member of NATO. So an ally in defense policy, if you like. So the development in Turkey is, of course, a sad story recently after Erdogan was going down that way when we talk about democracy, rule of law, and major issues like that. But still, I mean, the Turkey is an important neighbor, an important partner. In my opinion, it was always wrong to start negotiations with Turkey to become a full member of the European Union. I think this was a mistake. We should rather have a convincing neighborhood policy of the European Union, but this is not an answer which is giving a real answer to your question. So if you, in particularly with your background of this master's thesis, have further questions and would like to get a more substantiated answer, please write me an email.
Mr. Simon, I came with some kind of recommendation regarding that specific conflict. Is one of them is the constructive measure which Europe have always used to take. Some kind of like European Union is a constructive measure, like it's an example for the rest of the world. And the second thing is that like international law is not as much applicable in that specific issue. So Turkey being not the part of the law of seas and not legally bound to their specific laws. So I think the negotiation between them will be the perfect solution for that. Because international law, if we apply international law in their specific conflict like the island conflict, if we give the right to of mainland to the island of Greece, then the Turkey will gonna be deprived of their like basic rights. So I think Europe needs a kind of a more constructive measure, which has European Union has taken in the past. And the second thing is like between them, like they can Greece and Turkey can solve themselves by their negotiation. I think so. Up to now, like I have came with my thesis and the things. So I have came up with these two recommendations. Like you can take these two. So thank you for the answer. It was though although not the specific, but thank you very much, Mr. Simon.
I would be very much interested in your thesis. If you like, send it to me.
Oh, hello. My name is Martin McKinnon. I'm kind of the old fart of this crowd, but I'm from Canada. And when you live in Canada, in the words of our present Prime Minister's father, who was also Prime Minister, when you sleep next to an elephant, you have to be cognizant of all of their grunts and twitters, because it can be very dangerous. Canada, of course, is probably somewhere in between Europe and the United States, where, if you will, in the middle. I keep thinking about, heard earlier about Brexit, and just how unfortunate that was. And while I am not interested in blaming, I'm too old to go around blaming people. I don't think it accomplishes a hell of a lot. I would like to hear from you, because I often hear, because I deal in my business with Europe sometimes, is that it can be, the European Union can feel like we have no idea what they do. They just cost us a lot of money, and they seem to slow everything down. So when it comes to Brexit, let me ask you this. Is there anything the European Union could have done differently to have prevented the outcome?
Absolutely. I'm not very happy with the behavior of the European Union and the whole process. The European Union, I think I mentioned that to a certain extent in my introductory words. Here are too many, in particular here in Brussels, in the bubble, are too many people and colleagues who think, well, everything is in the right order. The European Union is the best thing ever, and nothing is wrong with democracy, with accountability. Nothing is wrong. All regulations are perfectly done and drafted. Nothing needs to be changed. And also the behavior after the referendum took place was in that very, in a way, arrogant way. Well, they made a mistake. Now let's leave them. Let's be united. That was a positive thing, okay? But it was also my impression that we have been very emotional on that issue. And I think there are several reasons which have never been analyzed here in the European Union, which led to the Brexit. And the danger I see is that if we go on with that and don't reflect ourselves and are self-critical with some certain issues, what in particular is concerned accountability of the governing structure. Now, for example, this vaccination issue, it's very differently seen in different member states. From the German perspective, it was an absolute disaster what the European Commission has done. But it's not even, I'm overdoing it a little bit, but it's not even allowed to speak in a critical way of this situation. Perhaps there was no mistake, but we don't even have a debate on the question whether there was a mistake or not. In my opinion today, but I was really doing a lot of research and I have the time to do it every day, not as a citizen who has to work and go to work every day. In my opinion, there was perhaps no mistake at all. But what the people think still is that it was not handled in a proper way. So a lack of public communication in Europe, a lack of plenary debates also in the European Parliament, for example, doesn't give the chance for communicating what you usually want to do in a democracy. And then we also must talk about the democratic deficit in the European Union. People want to choose in democracy and they want to elect, and sometimes they want to vote against somebody. And in the United States, you saw that. They voted for Trump, and 4 years later, they obviously voted against him. They wanted to get rid of him. So people have the impression democracy is functioning, democracy is working. And that is a problem in the European Union. In our electoral system, it goes on and goes on. For people, it doesn't make a difference whether you vote for this or that party. After it, it's a big pro-European coalition. All decisions are taken by consensus and nobody is accountable in the end. That is one thing. But in the United Kingdom, the story starts perhaps earlier. I remember my lecture with McEldowney. He was an Irish law professor, constitutional law. And he was talking a lot about Dicey and the highest constitutional principle in the United Kingdom, even if they don't have a written constitution, but that is the supremacy of parliament, parliamentary sovereignty. And which says basically parliament can do and undo whatever it wants, but it must not bind itself in the future. So already from this constitutional perspective, the United Kingdom had it most difficult to integrate in a supranational union where the parliament is bound by regulations and directives in the future, and the European Court of Justice wants to have, question whether it has, but wants to have a final say on everything, which is said also when we talk about sharing powers. It started with that constitutional problem. Then the elites in the United Kingdom have never been very happy with European integration. That is different in all elites on the continent. The United Kingdom never felt like being really European. I will never forget my first impression when I entered campus at Warwick University. There was a little shop where the newspapers were sold, and on the back side of one of those newspapers, the headline was titled, there was a crossword puzzle, and the headline was "Win a Trip to Europe." That was funny for me. I thought this is Europe, but it was not Europe. And then more precisely, I mean, when David Cameron started with that idea of a referendum, which was in the end a stupid mistake, but he never thought that the referendum would go in the wrong way. I'm convinced. He wanted to keep in power. And then decisions have been taken in a wrong way politically, many things. And if we never reflect on ourselves here in Brussels, in the bubble, and if we are not criticizing anything and there is no debate, then I fear that more and more people will be unhappy with the European Union, and I think we take the risk that others will leave the European Union. If the only thing which keeps us together is the money transfer from the donor countries to the receiver countries, we won't have a chance in the future.
I agree. Thank you.
So, dear Sven, on behalf of the IDI, we would like to thank you for sharing your experience, for sharing the insights from the European Union. Dear participants, we would like to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you all at our next online event on July 19th or at our local chapters. Please follow us on our social media to stay up to date. The event is now officially over. Thank you all for coming. We will now post the breakout room session, we will stay online for another 30 minutes and break out into several rooms in a few minutes. Thank you all for attending.